Hello, my name is George Stonefish. I am a Lenape. For those of you who are unaware, the Lenape populated this land. In other words, they were your landlords. However, due to historical problems with the colonists, they chased us out of this area so that we're scattered amongst the four winds. I'm from a reservation in Ontario, Canada, called the Delaware First Nations Reserve of the Thames. And up and around me, there's three different settlements or reservations of Delaware. There's Delaware in Wisconsin, in northern Wisconsin, and they abut the Menominee. There's also Delaware in Oklahoma, in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, and over near Tahlequah. There's also two settlements that are not recognized by the federal government in North and South Jersey. Now, that just goes to show they got rid of us because they wanted all of this land. However, we're still here, and individuals such as myself have come back to New York City, and we enjoy it. And I would like to welcome all of you here on behalf of my people. And to be very traditional, I think the most appropriate thing would be to sing you an honor song. And the honor song that I'm going to sing you basically says, stand and be proud of who you are. Because as Native people, we have always had the respect of other traditions, cultures, nationalities. And we've always believed that everybody has a place, and as long as they follow the instructions as handed down by the Creator for them, whether it's in Judaism, Catholicism, or anything else, that we would respect that. And we continue that today, even though we've suffered because of our beliefs. We believe it is the right way to live our lives. So with that, I'm going to sing you an honor song now, and I would request that all of you that can do what the song is going to say. Stand and be proud of who you are. Please, rise. And I don't need the mic to sing. So, let me give it back.
Thank you very much. What a wonderful way to start off this session. So now I'd like to introduce our panel, Eric Foner, and who's going to be our moderator, and Professors David Levering-Lewis, Beth Lew-Williams, and Cheryl Wall. And so I give it away to you, Eric. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here for this discussion about 1968, 50 years ago. Capsule biographies of our panelists are in the program, so I will not repeat them here. Looking around the group here, I see that some of us, Professor Lewis and myself, are old enough to remember 1968 very vividly, I'm sure. Some are too young to have been around at that time. So I'm going to just spend a couple of minutes reminding us of some of the things that happened in the year 1968, which was a year like 1848, 1919, 1989, years in which there was worldwide upheaval, and the pace of history seemed to speed up for that year. And we're still refighting, it seems, many of the battles of 1968. So some of the momentous events of 1968. In January, there was the Tet Offensive in Vietnam, which was a coordinated uprising of Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops, which completely surprised American military leaders. And even though it was defeated, it completely undermined confidence in the Johnson administration's assurances that the war was soon to end. February, often forgotten, the Orangeburg Massacre at South Carolina State, a African-American college in South Carolina, where the South Carolina Highway Patrol fired on student demonstrators. 3 were killed and 27 wounded. In March, after the New Hampshire primary, President Johnson announced that he was not going to run for re-election, to everyone's surprise. In April, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., which was followed by the greatest outbreak of urban violence in American history, and the military occupying dozens of cities to put it down. At the end of April, the student uprising at Columbia University, where I teach, the largest such event in American history up to that point, with hundreds of students occupied buildings and shut down the university. In June, the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. In August, in Chicago, the Democratic National Convention, with battles in the streets between police and anti-war demonstrators and pandemonium in the convention hall. In September, a group of feminists protested outside the Miss America pageant at Atlantic City, unfurling a banner inside the hall saying women's liberation. Things like this in physics, they say, produce an equal and opposite reaction. And the reaction came in November with the election of Richard Nixon as president of the United States. But more importantly, or more important to remember, is that this was an international year of protest. All over the world, young radicals challenged existing power structures. There were massive anti-war demonstrations in London, Rome, Paris, Tokyo. In Italy, students occupied and closed down universities throughout that country. In Paris, a nationwide student strike in May burgeoned into a general strike, which almost brought down the government of France. In Czechoslovakia, leaders attempting to reform the communist system there and to institute socialism with a human face, as they called it, were ousted by a Soviet invasion. At the Olympic Games in Mexico City, soldiers fired on student demonstrators, killing somewhere around 500 of them. And at the Olympics, 2 black athletes from the United States, John Carlos and Tommy Smith, raised their fists in a Black Power salute while on the podium, a kind of precursor to the demonstrations we've seen by athletes during the playing of the national anthem. In Northern Ireland, the police attacked a peaceful march of Catholic demonstrators inspired by the American Civil Rights Movement, which marked the beginning of what was called the Troubles, decades of violent conflict there. And throughout the world, what we call the second wave of American feminism found echoes among women who were protesting being relegated to unequal citizenship. One could go on and on, but obviously a lot happened in 1968, and there's a lot to talk about. So what I would like to do is ask each of our panelists in alphabetical order to speak briefly about what they think is most important or what strikes them as most memorable about the year 1968. And then we'll have a little bit of discussion and maybe at the end have time for one or two questions. So with that, I will turn the floor over to David Levering-Lewis. You have a mic? Or I do? Well, then you don't. Yeah.
This one is on? It is on?
Can you hear?
It's working.
Is the little green light up?
Mine is red.
Push the green light up. Or just use this one. Here, use that.
Here we've got something to go with. Eric, so much happened. Where to begin? Perfect storm of events, both domestic and international. I wondered when I signed on what I would say, and I asked myself, what did I not remember of that period? And so I thought I'd go with my strength, which is that as a result of the assassinations and the turmoil of that period, I wrote a book that had something to do with it. And so I thought, looking back, I would choose the month of March as historically pivotal. 8 days after much of the world recoiled from the Sunday bloodlettings on Alabama's Pettus Bridge, Lyndon Johnson delivered his "We Shall Overcome" speech to Congress on March 15. Presidential oratory, arguably unsurpassed in idealism and emotional impact. Speaking that night for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy, said Johnson, the president pledged his administration to secure the full blessings of American life for the Negro. Because, he said, it is not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome. Stupefaction seized whites in the Deep South. Astute students of Southern politics record the so-called Great White Switch in party loyalty that went into warp drive soon after Johnson's arresting oration. A week later, the Great March from Selma to Montgomery commenced under federal protection. Selma was a victory as much for Lyndon Johnson as for Martin King, the civil rights leadership, together with the interracial, interfaith, and across-classes solidarity of Selma's marching thousands. The Voting Rights Bill became law at the beginning of August 1965 with Mrs. Rosa Parks, Dr. King, and the principal civil rights leaders present at the White House signing ceremony. Hardly had voting rights been added to the victories of Medicare, model cities in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, then LBJ began the fateful military ventures that compromised his great society legacy. Hardly had King and his SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Council General Staff, begun to plan the next chapter in nonviolent racial progress than they and the nation recoiled in shock from the Watts race rioting of Los Angeles 5 days after the signing of the Voting Rights Act. 10 days after the White House voting rights ceremony, Martin King risked his first publicly noted criticism of the Vietnam War in an address to some 3,500 members and participants of his SCLC annual convention. 1 month later, at the president's insistence, the Nobel laureate and UN ambassador Arthur Goldberg engaged in a frank 70-minute Vietnam give and take. Speaking after to the United Nations Press Corps, King frankly divulged his unthinkable proposals: a bombing pause, talks with the Viet Cong, a United Nations recognition of communist China, the negative firestorm sweeping the civil rights communities matched the fury of the administration and the disdain of the media. One had then a sensation almost from that moment of watching history accelerate beyond the controlling reach of President Johnson and Dr. King. The Grand Coalition unravels, and soon founders before black demands for total citizenship in the shortest possible time on the one hand, and the public's disenchantment with Johnson's administration's Vietnam War. Before the year ended, Johnson approved General Westmoreland's classified request for 144,000 troops to supplement the 33,000 already engaged in propping up the Saigon regime. One sees Lyndon Baines Johnson fast sinking into the Vietnam quagmire with his Great Society vision, and Martin Luther King increasingly isolated as his accelerated socioeconomic quest cuts against the grain of American exceptionalism. Johnson was stunned when 47 Republicans trimmed the Democrat majority in the House in the 1966 midterms. A brooding president insisted that he hadn't lost that election. He thought the Negroes lost it. The looming law and order presidential candidacy of Richard Nixon, the undead in Gore Vidal's felicitous phrase, and another run by Alabama's George Wallace after his terrifying national appeal in 1964 represented the powerful transformational forces unleashed by the Vietnam War and the Great Society. On April 4, 1967, a year to the day of his assassination, Martin Luther King broke publicly and decisively with his president at Riverside Church. He came not to address Ho Chi Minh, but those fellow Americans, quote, who bore the greatest responsibility for ending a conflict that had torn apart both continents. Fair to say, on the January 1968 Tet Offensive, as we've heard, spoke even more forcefully to the American public. Lawrence O'Donnell's new book on 1968, Playing with Fire, is a fine homage to the quixotic Eugene McCarthy, whose improbable upending of Lyndon Johnson in the March 1968 New Hampshire primary altered electoral history and pushed Robert Kennedy into breaking with Johnson on Vietnam and into his opportunistic challenge of McCarthy in a quartet of state primaries. But then, too, Nixon had won the GOP New Hampshire primary. A Nixon win that temporarily dissuaded Nelson Rockefeller and terminated the GOP version of Eugene McCarthy, the liberal Michigan governor, George Romney, who was committed to civil rights and disengagement from the war. Still, Nixon worried about George Wallace's red meat law and order appeal and was made increasingly nervous by Ronald Reagan's emergence as a more congenial edition of George Wallace. So, looking forward from 1968, liberal republicanism died in Miami at the GOP convention. The party moved south and west geographically and ideologically, giving the nation Nixon and Reagan. As too often happens in U.S. political history, determined either by assassination or the Electoral College, King and RFK vanished. The lame Hubert Humphrey, with LBJ's indifferent support, lost the presidency by a 1 percentage point. George Wallace would recognize Donald Trump's indebtedness. Thank you.
I think this is going to work. So I'm not old enough to actually remember 1968, but I think that I am definitely still living in its legacy, especially given my own focus as a historian of Asian Americans in particular. So I'm going to talk about 3 events that I think were significant in 1968 but have not come up yet, and are particularly significant for the Asian American community. The first is the Malai Massacre that happened in March 16th, 1968. And although the American public wouldn't learn about it for another year because of a cover-up, but it was an egregious event within the context of a very bloody war in Vietnam, in which American soldiers went into the small hamlet of Malai, thinking that they would encounter Viet Cong adversaries, and instead they found a sleepy village full of civilians and proceeded to kill them all, men and women and children and babies. And it was just an extreme moment in the Vietnam War, and extremely upsetting to the American public when they learned about it a year later. But I think that it helps us to think about what the American public didn't know in 1968. They didn't know about this massacre. They didn't have a full grasp on how badly America was losing this war. And they didn't have a sense that the war was spilling out into Laos and then into Cambodia, and that it was becoming a multi-nation war. I think that this event also reminds us that that war and that year and that created a different kind of trauma and different kinds of wounds for the refugees that would then come to America later from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, different sort of wounds than the American public and as American veterans held after that war. The second thing that I want to talk about is just the invention of the term Asian American in the first place. It was invented in 1968. Before that, most people referred to Asian Americans as Orientals. And Oriental had a lot of baggage. The Orient was seen as the stagnant, opposite, irrational, feminine version of the West. It was seen as the opposite of the West. And it was a pejorative term alongside other pejorative terms, including coming out of the war, gook, and then also nation-based terms where people saw Asians as individual, Japanese, Chinese, or sort of the uglier cousins of these words that we know, Chinaman or Jap. And so it was in this context, where there was no term to define a pan-Asian ethnic identity, that a scholar and activist at UC Berkeley, Yuji Ichioka, invented the term Asian American. And he did so to bring together different Asian ethnic political organizations on campus at Berkeley into the Asian American Political Association. Asian American Political Alliance. And I think that this act, it seems small, but it's an act of self-naming and therefore self-empowerment that declared that there was such an identity of Pan-Asianness in the United States. And I think that has changed our lexicon today, and it has changed our understanding of the racial categories in America. The last event that I'll mention is over 3-month strike that happened at San Francisco State University, starting in 1968. It was a strike in which students who were Black, white, Native, Asian American, Latino, all banded together and walked out of class for 3 months. It's hard to picture now what would happen if my students walked out for 3 months. But they walked out and they demanded 3 things, essentially. They wanted ethnic studies, they wanted the diversification of their faculty, and they wanted the diversification of their student body. And I think that these 3 things that are essentially, they wanted to classes that taught them about people of color, taught by people of color, to students of color. And I think that those three demands and the way that they were echoed across the nation has changed what our university is today. Who is educated and by whom, and what is considered essential education in the United States. And when they band together under the name the Third World Liberation Front. And I'll just make this last point. That's the name that they chose for themselves when they brought these multiracial coalition together. And I think that term doesn't make a lot of sense now. And my students, it seems very strange to them. Why would you call yourself the Third World Liberation Front? But they did it because they were trying to draw a connection, not just between different racial groups in the United States, to say that all these racial groups have experienced some form of colonialism in the United States. But they were also trying to draw that struggle, the struggle for racial inclusion and civil rights in America, and draw a connection to the anti-colonial and anti-war struggle going on across the globe. And so by calling themselves the Third World Liberation Front, they were trying to say that their fight in San Francisco had something to do with the war and the massacre going on in Vietnam.
You better think about what you're trying to do to me. Think. Let your mind go and let yourself be free. Aretha Franklin's Think powered over the airwaves in the spring of 1968, providing a soundtrack to the protests and rebellions that were breaking out everywhere. The refrain goes all the way back to the spirituals, oh, freedom, which she actually sings, freedom, freedom. Her scream, so urgent and piercing, made whatever liberation the hearer was seeking seem eminently at hand. The lyrics worked at once to put white America on notice that it was running out of time to accede to Black Americans' demand for social justice, and an intimate communication to a lover to change his hurtful ways. Like Respect, Aretha's anthem of the previous year, Think anticipated the often expressed tenet of the women's movement: the personal is political. But in the moment, with Think, Franklin, who had long been associated with the civil rights movement and with Dr. King in particular, Franklin channeled the growing revolutionary fervor that was Black Power. The cultural arm of the Black Power movement was known as the Black Arts Movement, or BAM. Its manifesto, Black Fire, an anthology of Afro-American writing edited by Leroy Jones, soon to be Amiri Baraka, and Larry Neal, was published in '68. Neal declared, "The artist and the political activists are one," and 75 contributors, including playwright Ed Bowens, activist Stokely Carmichael, poet Sonia Sanchez, and the South African exile Willie Kokostili, who later would be named Poet Laureate of South Africa and who passed away earlier this year, along with avant-garde composer Sun Ra, subscribed to Neal's dictum. In a book-length poem, In the Mecca, the title refers to an apartment building on the south side of Chicago. Gwendolyn Brooks affirmed her allegiance to the Black arts movement as she left behind the Chaucerian Rhyme Royale, along with the sonnets and villanelles that had won her the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry in 1950, and took up free verse. Signs of Brooks's influence from both before and after 1968 are visible in the poetry of a range of present-day poets, including Elizabeth Alexander, Natasha Trethewey, and Kevin Young. More broadly, the literary turn to a more public, declamatory mode of poetry and to poems addressed explicitly to a Black audience marked a change that continues to reverberate. One could draw a line from the Black arts poets to today's spoken word artist, and from Amiri Baraka to hip-hop. On campuses that spring, students protested the war in Vietnam, as well as inequality at home. They demanded changes at the universities they attended, as well, agitating for a more diverse student population and a revised curriculum. And I should say here that I am old enough to remember 1968, and I was part of the protest, just a really small part of the protest at Howard University that March, when a group of over 1,000 students took over the administration building and demanded a change in curriculum that the shorthand, for which the shorthand was from the capstone of Negro education to towards a Black university. The seeds of what would become Black studies, now African American or Africana studies, were sown that year. Soon after, those programs were joined by programs and eventually departments in women's and gender studies, Asian American studies, Latina studies, and gay studies. The knowledge production in these fields has transformed the more traditional disciplines so that academic departments, at least in the humanities and social sciences, look different today from the way they looked 50 years ago. As was true of institutions across the board, the academy was put on notice, and it changed.
All of the speakers in one way or another have kind of suggested, obviously, that we can't just look at 1968 in isolation. This was a pivotal time in what we call the 60s, which is both a chronological period and a state of mind, I guess, but also how the reverberations of what happened in 68 are still with us, for better or worse, often for better in my opinion, in our society today. And yet so many of the achievements or demands by the various movements we've heard, but there were many, many other movements at that time, the American Indian movement, and soon afterwards seizing, Alcatraz, and many other Wounded Knee, many other demonstrated by all sorts of groups demanding equality in the country. So I wonder if any of you would like to talk for a minute about what you see today as the legacy of 1968. We've heard about our current president, he who shall not be named, channeling George Wallace, as well as a few other figures in American history, like Ross Perot, perhaps. We've heard about the way the universities were, I think, really dramatically changed. But what strikes any of you as the sort of way today we can see 1968 in our lives and institutions?
I suppose our gratitude to that messy movement called the Civil Rights Movement. It has always struck me that as an organized movement, the Civil Rights Movement, represented by the NAACP or the Urban League or any number of nomenclatures that are inspired by it, have failed to possess the consequences of what they did. That is to say, the manumission, or the beginning of women, clearly begins in the Mississippi Freedom Summer. I think the first ambition was a national association of women, first nomenclature there. It, of course, leads inexorably to identity, that the gay rights movement, again, follows on. And then the spiral continues with environment, with people challenged in various ways. the transgressiveness of what appeared to be at the time, or at any particular time, with Columbia deans held prisoner, with faculty not having students to teach, and I don't know at San Francisco whether or not there were checks that would continue to flow during that month. But all of this has moved us into a kind of modernity that we almost take for granted, and yet we can't take for granted because only 60 or 70% at good years of us believe that 1968 and its consequences are good. We know now that it's not a triumph in terms of numbers, as this recent election, with all of its electoral consequences that are quite bizarre. And so the battle continues. I think we are, though, you have emphasized the international nature of '68, and to do that, I would think that if there is a memory of something that happened in Europe that invites our serious parallelism, it is that we are so much on the cusp of a moment very much like 1933, when the Weimar Republic, a wonderful experiment in so many ways, artistic and generational and political, vanished, electorally vanished. And we see in fake news and a fake Republican Party, we see that day by day we are edging into the loss of control of our government in ways that are really unique. Never before has democracy been so imperiled, I think.
Go ahead. Anyone else want to comment?
Well, it's hard to follow that because it is just so chilling and I think so true. I would say that for me, one of the things that doesn't begin, it goes all the way back, but redefining the American we has just been a project of progressive people in this country for a very long time. I think we made real progress, or real progress was made in 1968. I do think that progress remains fragile, but we do see, I'm trying to find the little light at the end of the tunnel. We do see that we has expanded since 1968. And I think on the level of popular culture, as problematic as it often is, the idea of what American popular culture is, or U.S. popular culture is today, is far more inclusive in terms of its definition than it was in '68. I think who participates in politics, electoral politics, is far more inclusive than it was in 1968. And as we've said, universities are much more inclusive, which is not to say that they've been transformed. It's the reason I wanted to say and to point to humanities and social sciences. If one went to schools of engineering or business schools, one would draw really different conclusions. So.
Beth, did you want to say something?
Very briefly. I'm trying to see what I want to add. I think that, one of the things that I'm struck by is that the focus on race and racial inclusion and identity was so dramatic and such a sweeping change in the 60s in general and in 1968. When it strikes me that we are still in the backlash that very much we started to see in 1968 against that. And I think that some of that backlash unfortunately shows us the limitations of what was demanded in 1968. And I would just very briefly say that although many of these movements for racial inclusion also had within them demands for women's rights, and they had class-based demands, they became and are remembered often about identity politics and about race. And I think that the class basis of all of this is less remembered, and it's very much what we're seeing today.
Well, we have the people running the show here today have signaled that our time is basically up, so unfortunately we will not really be able to take questions, although people can converse among themselves about these issues, which obviously are still with us. I suppose one lesson of the 60s is that rights are not self-enforcing. Even when they are achieved, they have to be defended with vigilance, and we're still sort of in the process of trying to do that today. So we can't just rest on our laurels of the real accomplishments that the 60s did achieve. But anyway, thank you all for coming. This is just the beginning of a really remarkable day. I urge you all to take advantage of the events now starting at 1 o'clock in the various studios, and thanks very much for taking part.